All right, listener, are you ready for this?
Yeah.
You wanted a deep dive into spooky experiences. Well, we found a fascinating one just in time for Bhoot Shadadoshi. You know the Hindi festival all about ghosts?
Oh, yeah.
We've got this first-hand account from a Bollywood actor, Ranajoy Bishnu. Is it a ghost story? Sleep paralysis? Or something else? I guess that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
To examine the evidence together.
I have to admit, I am intrigued. Celebrity ghost stories, they always seem to capture the imagination, right?
Yeah, for sure.
It's like their brush with fame sort of makes the impossible seem just a little bit more
Oh,
possible.
exactly. I mean, it makes you wonder, right? Like, are they more susceptible to these types of things? Or
Right.
is it just that we're more interested when it happens to them?
Yeah.
Anyway, so Bishnu's story takes place about 5 or 6 years ago, back when he was living in Mumbai working on a web series. Sounds glamorous already, right?
Oh, yeah.
But here's where it gets creepy. He was sharing a flat with a roommate, and it was right near a graveyard. And not just any graveyard, okay? It was in a predominantly Marathi neighborhood.
Hmm. That's interesting. The setting itself is practically a character in the story.
Mm.
Graveyards, especially in certain cultures, they're often seen as liminal spaces, places where that veil between the living and the dead is thin.
Okay, so you're saying the graveyard's atmosphere itself could have contributed to what happened to him, like it primed him for something spooky.
It's possible. I mean, our surroundings and the stories that we associate with them, right, it can definitely influence our perceptions and expectations.
That's so interesting. So we've got a Bollywood actor, a graveyard, a city known for its folklore. It's like a recipe for a spooky tale. But here's a little twist for you. Vishnu starts his account by saying that he didn't believe in ghosts at all. Like, he was a total skeptic.
Wow.
He was confident that all of his travels, all of his life experiences had basically made him immune to this stuff. Talk about tempting fate, huh?
That's interesting because that initial skepticism, you see that a lot in paranormal accounts, actually.
Hmm.
It's almost as if the experience needs to be, I don't know, undeniably powerful to shatter that pre-existing belief system.
That makes you think about the psychology behind it all, right? Like, do you have to be a believer to experience something? Or can a skeptic just stumble into something totally unexplainable?
That's a good question, one that researchers have been exploring for years. There's this theory that our beliefs and our expectations, well, they can influence our perceptions and experiences. In other words, if you believe in ghosts, you might be more likely to interpret something ambiguous that you hear, that you see, that you sense as a ghostly presence.
So even if it wasn't a ghost, just the power of suggestion could still create a terrifying experience. And I mean, in this situation, right, he's living next to this graveyard. He's probably hearing all these local stories, and he's probably absorbing all these cultural beliefs,
Right.
even if he's consciously dismissing them.
Precisely. It's like our minds are creating a framework for interpreting those experiences, even if we aren't fully aware of it.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of the matter, okay? So one night, Vishnu's roommate is away, and he's all alone in the flat. It's nighttime. And suddenly, he feels this intense pressure on his chest. Like something is pinning him down. He tries to move, he tries to speak, but he's completely paralyzed.
This description immediately makes me think of sleep paralysis. It's a phenomenon that a lot of people misinterpret as a paranormal experience.
Mm.
That feeling of being held down, inability to move, can't speak, but being very aware of your surroundings, it can be absolutely terrifying.
And he said that he could see everything around him perfectly clearly, which must have amplified that feeling of helplessness. Can you imagine being fully conscious? But you're trapped in your own body. You can't react. He starts calling out for his mother. His cries are getting more and more desperate.
And this is where the social aspect of the experience comes in. His neighbors from the upstairs flat, hearing these frantic cries, they come rushing down to check on him.
And it's from them that he learns about the neighborhood's kind of spooky reputation. Apparently, there had been similar incidents reported in the area, and maybe it was linked to a suicide that happened nearby.
This is where that cultural context becomes really important. You see, the idea of suicides leading to hauntings, it's a belief you find in a lot of cultures, especially in India.
So is this just a coincidence? A skeptic, living next to a graveyard, suddenly experiences something terrifying, and it just happens to line up with local legends. It's like straight out of a movie.
It definitely raises questions about the interplay between personal experience and cultural narratives.
And speaking of cultural narratives, you
Yeah.
mentioned that link between suicides and hauntings in a lot of cultures, especially in India. Can you elaborate on that a bit?
Certainly, in many cultures, suicide is seen as a very traumatic event, and it can disrupt the natural order of things, the sudden and often violent nature of that kind of death. A lot of people believe that it can leave behind unresolved energy or emotions, which can manifest as a restless spirit. It's not so much about blaming the person, the person who took their own life, but acknowledging the lingering emotional turmoil that's associated with a tragedy like that.
That's a really good point. It's not something I had really considered before, but yeah, it makes sense. So Vishnu, he started as a skeptic, but this encounter and then the stories he had heard, it kind of forced him to confront the possibility that maybe there were things in this world that just couldn't be explained away
Oh,
easily.
yeah. Remember, he was a skeptic. But this encounter,
Yeah.
combined with the stories,
Right.
it forced him to think that maybe, just maybe, there were things that science couldn't explain.
Yeah. So what happened next? Did he become a full-blown believer?
Well, he doesn't explicitly say that, but his behavior definitely changed. Vishnu used to be totally fine, sleeping in complete darkness. But now he insists on keeping a picture of a deity by his bed
Yeah.
and a light on all night, especially when he's alone.
Wow, that is a big change. It sounds like even if he didn't fully embrace the idea of ghosts, the experience really affected him, like his sense of security and well-being. How common is that? Do people often change their beliefs or behaviors after these kinds of things happen?
It's more common than you think.
Yeah.
Even people who are skeptical, they approach these events with skepticism.
Right.
They often find themselves reevaluating what they believe or adopting new rituals, for comfort and protection. It's a natural human response to the unknown and the potentially unsettling.
It's like even if you can't explain it, you still have to find a way to cope with the emotional and psychological fallout. Speaking of coping mechanisms, the picture of the deity and the light, is that common in India? Or is that more specific to Vishnu and what he believes?
It's a practice that's rooted in both personal faith and cultural tradition. In Hinduism, deities are often seen as sources of protection and guidance. So keeping an image nearby, it can offer a sense of comfort and security, especially when you're facing fear or uncertainty.
And the light, is that religious too, or is it more about just feeling safer?
Probably a little bit of both. Light, in a lot of cultures, including India, it represents knowledge, safety, dispelling negative energy. So in his case, it seems to provide a sense of security in a situation that left him feeling vulnerable.
So these practical responses, the light, the picture, they're tied to these deeper cultural and psychological layers.
Absolutely. It shows how these events, these experiences, aren't just about what happened, but about the meaning we give them, the ways we try to understand them.
Okay, so we've got his experience, the local stories, the cultural context. But what does it all mean for us, the listeners? What can we take away from all this?
I think there are a few key takeaways. First, it shows us that even today, in our modern world, there are still things that happen that we just don't understand and can't easily explain.
It's like a reminder that we don't have all the answers, and that's okay. There's still mystery and wonder in our lives.
Exactly. Second, Vishnu's story really shows us how personal experience, cultural narratives, and just the psychology of belief all play a part in how we see things. What we believe can influence what we perceive, what we experience, and vice versa.
So it's not just about whether ghosts are real or not, but about how our beliefs shape how we see the world, and then how our experiences can change those beliefs.
Exactly. And finally, I think this deep dive should encourage us to approach these types of stories with curiosity, but also with critical thinking. You don't have to dismiss them as nonsense, but you don't have to accept them as absolute truth either. We can just explore the different perspectives, the different cultural contexts, the different possible explanations.
You're right. It's about being open-minded, but not gullible. So as we wrap this up, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that there's so much we don't understand about the world and our place in it, and that's okay.
I agree. It's that mystery that keeps us curious, keeps us exploring, keeps us pushing the boundaries.
And maybe someday we'll have more answers. But until then, I think it's important to approach these stories with skepticism and wonder.
I agree. Embracing the unknown without being afraid.
So listener, as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe you'll think twice about that creak in the floorboards or that shadow in the corner of your eye.
And remember, whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's always something we can learn from the stories we tell and the experiences we share.
Sleep tight, everyone, and keep those lights on if you need to. Until next time, keep exploring the mysteries of the world around you. Was it a genuine encounter with something supernatural? Or was it just really vivid sleep paralysis? Or maybe even a little of both? Or could it be, like we were saying, like his surroundings, the stories he'd heard, it just created the perfect conditions for something spooky to happen, regardless of what the real source was?
And we can't forget about the timing of this whole thing. He shared this right before Boot Chatterdoshi.
Hmm.
When the veil between worlds is supposed to be thin. Do you think that's a coincidence?
That's a good point. It makes you think if there's something about these specific times of year, these festivals, these celebrations, that just make us more aware of the unexplained, like those ghost stories you hear around a campfire. They're always scarier in the dark.
Absolutely. Our surroundings, the context, it can really affect how we experience things. But it makes you wonder, right? Are we just more in tune with these possibilities during certain times? Or is there something really different going on, something metaphysical? It's a question people have been asking for centuries.
Yeah, like those spooky stories, the beliefs. They almost become part of the atmosphere, and they change how we see the world.
Exactly. It's this interplay between cultural stories,
Mm-hmm.
personal beliefs, the power of suggestion. And it's not just ghosts either. Think about UFOs or cryptids. The culture really shapes how those are seen and understood.
Yeah, it's like our brains, right? We're always trying to find patterns, explanations. So when something happens that we don't understand, we tend to rely on the stories we know, the beliefs we've been taught.
That's why it's so important to think critically, like we were talking about. Ask yourself, what could be affecting this person's perception? Are there other ways to explain this? Don't just dismiss it, but don't just blindly accept it either.
Right. So as we finish up this deep dive, I think the biggest takeaway for me is we still have so much to learn about the world,
Mhm.
about ourselves, and that's okay.
I agree. It's that mystery that
Mhm.
keeps us curious, keeps us asking questions, keeps us exploring.
Yeah. And who knows, maybe one day we'll have more answers. But until then, we should approach these stories with a little bit of skepticism and a little bit of wonder.
That's a great way to put it. Embrace the unknown. Don't be afraid of it.
So, listener, tonight, when you're trying to fall asleep, maybe you'll think twice about that creaking sound you hear, or that shadow in the corner of your room.
And remember, it doesn't matter if you believe in ghosts or not. There's always something we can learn from the stories we tell each other and the things that happen to us.
Sleep tight, everyone, and keep those lights on if you need to. Until next time, keep exploring the mysteries all around you.